Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica and our quasi-continuing series on the MARS FPGA project. Because the last few videos you guys have had an absolute metric ton of questions for me because I do talk a lot about FPGA devices. And while this video is going to have to go just off a spec sheet, I'm going to talk about the specifications that have been announced for MARS FPGA, what that means for the project as well as the hardware that it could possibly handle. And obviously you can tell already I'm showing a Dreamcast here because it is one of the higher test cores that has been previewed for MARS FPGA. But popping over to their Twitter, the number one specification everyone keeps asking about is the TI-180 FPGA chip. And if you can't tell already, there's a bunch of numbers up there and we're going to talk about what they mean. But the first thing we want to talk about are the actual logic elements on the chip being at 176,256. That's the total LEs or logic elements. We're going to be referring to LEs a lot in the video, so just be aware that when I say LEs or logic elements, I mean the exact same thing. Now compared to the DE10 Nano from Jurassic, the heart of the MiSTer FPGA project, that has 110,000 logic elements in it approximately, and those are all of what you're reconfiguring those logic elements to create a new board. Now I did a video a while ago about what FPGA is, but those logic elements are reconfigured from HDL and Verilog code on the fly to reconfigure the gates to become the logic of the chips that FPGA is trying to, for lack of a better term, emulate. It gets way more scientific and electrical engineering than that. Just be aware that there's a certain set configuration of gates that an FPGA will use to replicate original hardware. Now sometimes that is done off decapping chips and scanning them, sometimes that's working back in a reverse engineering standpoint. But when we talk about the amount of LEs on the MARS project and a prospective Dreamcast core, we have to fit that core within the logic element footprint that exists. Now someone like Electron Ash was poking at a prospective Dreamcast core for the MiSTer FPGA, and it would require something like an SH4 top hat going into the IO board, and while he has been poking at this and giving me updates, it doesn't seem like something that the MiSTer could do. And that is the thing about LEs. It is a quantity, but what I need you to realize is that not every single logic element is created equal. Every FPGA developer has a different style of doing things, and some of those logic elements can be better or worse than others. Now again, not an electrical engineer, but ePhoenix here, their Titanium TI-180 series is going to have all the specs on their webpage, but it's a low power, small footprint FPGA that is really good to be used for a project like this, just like the DE10 Nano is for MiSTer. So when you see that this has another approximately like 66,000 logic elements compared to MiSTer FPGA, that means it does have a higher ceiling as to what can fit on it. And you'll see here that it comes in so many different packages with different pin amounts. Basically all chips have variations in their package design for different implementations, and if you really want to get nerdy about it, you can even go down, look at the available packages and see how the logic, the DDR, and other specs are laid up on the silicon themselves. This is not one chip, it is one family of chips that have different variants for it. But let's talk about logic elements in general and what that means towards the recreation of a console in FPGA. Something like the Nintendo 64 core on MiSTer right now is getting higher up into the ceiling of what the project can actually do. Sure, we can play Pilot Wing 64 and this core is shaping up to be incredible, but it is pushing at the upper limit of what's available as far as horsepower is concerned on the Jurassic DE10 Nano, but it's impressive as what it is doing. So if we can run something like Nintendo 64 on MiSTer FPGA, then you would assume that something like MARS could run it as well. So we're trying to kind of build a floor and a ceiling for what that FPGA could do, because the current core is hovering around 90,000 logic elements, but what you need to know is you can't use every single one of them. You're going to see bottlenecking and speed issues once you get towards the upper echelon of what that chip allows for. It's not like a $100 bill. You can't spend all $100. Think the last $5 would basically be worth 10 cents. The ceiling is not achievable. But the thing about FPGA projects, MiSTer and MARS, is that we're not just going to be recreating everything in FPGA. Sure, the SH4 and the PowerVR chip would have to be an FPGA for it to be an FPGA core, but there's going to be an ARM core on MARS the same way there is on MiSTer. That can handle stuff like the operating system and other higher level things that aren't part of the actual silicon that an FPGA chip is trying to reproduce. So while you do need the main chips of Dreamcast running on that FPGA chip in MARS, a lot of the higher level OS stuff can be done on an ARM core, not the operating system for Dreamcast, but the operating system for MARS itself. Or take a look at something like the PlayStation 1 core on MiSTer FPGA. This again, at least on the 2X core, was a test to see how much overhead on a CPU speed could be done on the logic element quantity and the logic elements in and of themselves on the MiSTer project, because the thing about FPGA devices and logic elements is it's not just a quantitative thing. If you have 100,000 logic elements and you need 90, sure, you're going to fit in that overhead, but you need to worry about things like clock speeds too. Especially on something like the A0486 core, people just seem to think that you could increase the clock speed by changing the multiplier, because honestly it was just an oscillating crystal, but the speed of devices is important in the design in FPGA, along with the quantity of actual logic gates you need. Now on the other specification side, you've got the RAM, 1GB of DDR4, you've got 128 megabytes of SD RAM, something similar that we see on MiSTer, and then some other data about the user I/O and snack support, and the 4K video output. And of course this is going to have analog as well. MARS has stated that in the spec sheet. They're going to be working on pretty much every analog source, and that would be expected for an FPGA device at this point in time, especially with their arcade emphasis and focus. You do want to be able to hook it up to a PVM or an arcade monitor. So that's going to be something that seems to mirror over to MiSTer, and a lot of that stuff can be done on the FPGA or on the ARM core. You can do that different ways and still have a fully faithful FPGA core for something like Dreamcast. But I am looking forward to hearing more about that actual analog, because right now I'm talking about the House of the Dead on Model 2, which has not been mentioned for MARS whatsoever. I'm using this example because this uses a medium resolution monitor, and they have reference dealing with medium resolution analog outputs. Medium resolution is a pain in the butt format, and I hate it. But moving over to something like Lupin III, the shooting on Naomi, a core that they have been teasing, this is going to use IR sensors, so a lot of the analog out is going to have to be paired with some sort of ability to have a light gun on the system with some IR sensors. I'm really looking forward to hearing that. But something like Dreamcast, the most previewed core, you're going to get 240p out, you're going to get 31 kilohertz out if it is done in the way that the hardware is designed, because both the Dreamcast and the Naomi are going to give you that VGA output, just with different ways to hook it up. Now, a lot of you have been asking me if this means that something like the Nintendo GameCube or the PlayStation 2 could come to MARS. I want to be very clear about something. Again, not an electrical engineer, a filmmaker. Just because the GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox are technically part of the same generation of consoles that the Dreamcast competed in, does not mean they are part of the same generation of technical advancements that were going on in gaming. Something like the GameCube is going to be fundamentally much more architecturally advanced than the Dreamcast. Now, I don't know if it's going to fit in the 170,000 and change logic elements on something like MARS. They haven't talked about it whatsoever. The only reason I'm even referencing the GameCube here is because people in the comments seem to think this could mean that this would work. Honestly, I highly doubt it, but again, I am a filmmaker. We're talking about PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, Naomi era of stuff, and arcade games that are on the higher end of the 2D or 3D spectrum. That's just kind of how it goes. Now, as far as how they're reverse engineering these cores, a lot of you have asked me if this is done by de-litting silicon. I do not know. But remember, a lot of research has been done on a lot of common chips. For the most part, you don't de-lit something unless you absolutely have to if it's a custom that no one's ever seen before. Something like a 3DO M2. If you wanted to recreate this in FPGA, wink wink nudge nudge, if anybody's listening, you should definitely do this, please. You would probably have to de-lid the Bulldog ASIC as well as some of the other custom chips on the board. But as far as the dual power PC 602 processors, probably not necessary, because so much is known about the PowerPC architecture, you really wouldn't need to worry about silicon scans on that. But as far as whether or not they're doing this, I don't know. I'm sure we'll find out soon. But this does mean that something like the MARS FPGA project could probably run my 3DO M2. So if you want me to give this a high recommend, start teasing the M2 over here. I will definitely tell everyone to buy it if it does in fact work. And all jokes aside, I would love to see a 3DO M2 core, because for a console that never actually released, it does have a very good library of games on it. I own them all. But what I want you to understand is specifications are just numbers on a sheet of paper until someone comes and does anything with them. You could hand me the world's most expensive guitar and I wouldn't know anything to do with it, because I can't play guitar in the first place. So what can happen on MARS is down to the coders and the overhead on that chip. Something like Dreamcast definitely seems to be plausible. It might take a long time to do it. I don't know what the coding hours are in there, but as far as anything over Dreamcast, and you guys asked me about GameCube, I just don't know. But if you have any other MARS questions, leave them down below. If you want to see a certain video on the topic, I will definitely make it if it sounds interesting. But short of that, MARS FPGA has more logic elements. It's going to have 4K out, but otherwise we still need to wait and hear from developers to find out what else they have planned that would be beyond Dreamcast and Naomi. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.